Mr. President, I rise in strong support of the legislation on the floor. I think most members understand that as part of the 2013 bipartisan budget agreement, language was included which cut COLAs for military retirees. I think most members here in the Senate and the House understand that that was a mistake, an oversight, and it's something that should be rectified, and it should be rectified now. Promises made to people in the military should be kept, and our job is to do that. Mr. President, what I want to do this morning is say a word on broader issues impacting the veterans community, and I say that as the chairman of the Senate Veterans Committee. Shortly, when this legislation is disposed of, we are going to move on to a comprehensive piece of legislation that addresses many of the very serious problems facing our veterans community. And this morning, I just wanted to give a brief, say a few words, give a brief overview of what that legislation does. The legislation is the Comprehensive Veterans Health and Benefits and Military Retirement Pay Restoration Act of 2014. It is S. 1982. And the first point that I want to make, Mr. President, is that I honestly believe that in terms of veterans issues, there is widespread bipartisan support. I can tell you that on our committee, the Veterans Committee, every member of that committee, Democrat or Republican, or in my case, independent, believes very much that we owe our veterans more than we can provide them. Their sacrifices are too deep, the pain too great, but that all members of that committee in a bipartisan way are doing their best to protect the interest of our veterans, and I want to thank all of them for their hard work. And to as great a degree as possible, the bill that will be on the floor, the Comprehensive Veterans Bill, is a bipartisan bill. It contains many provisions brought forth by my Republican colleagues. This bill consists of two omnibus bills that were unanimously passed by the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, unanimously, support of Democrats and Republicans. It also includes other provisions that had strong bipartisan support. This legislation also contains two new provisions, both of which have bipartisan support. The first new addition addresses the restoration of cuts made to military retiree COLAs as a result of the 2013 bipartisan budget agreement, the exact same issue that is being debated on the floor right now. We also have that language in our bill. Promises made to veterans have got to be kept. We've got to restore those cuts to COLAs for military retirees. And the second new provision that was not discussed, frankly, by the committee is also has widespread bipartisan support. It authorizes the VA to enter into 27 major medical facility leases in 18 states and Puerto Rico. Also, interestingly enough, the legislation that will soon be on the floor contains two major provisions already passed by the House Republicans. So, to as great a degree as possible, in terms of language in the bill, in terms of working with our Republican colleagues in the House, this is a bipartisan bill and should have the support of every member of the Senate who believes in protecting the interest of veterans, and I hope that is the vast majority of the people here. Mr. President, as Senator Begich just mentioned a moment ago, our veterans have paid a very, very heavy price. And if you were to ask me what I have learned in the 1 year, a little bit more than a year that I've been chairman of the Veterans Committee, is I think most Americans, including myself, were not fully aware of what that sacrifice was. And what that sacrifice was just in recent years was not just the loss of over 6,700 Americans who lost their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, but the impact of those wars on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of veterans who came home either wounded in body, loss of arms, loss of legs, loss of hearing, loss of sight, or the more invisible wounds of war. And, Mr. President, what most Americans don't know, and it's a rather shocking number, but we are now dealing with hundreds of thousands of men and women who came home from Iraq and Afghanistan who are doing their best to cope with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has a terrible impact on their lives, on their families' lives, on their ability to go out and get a job and keep a job, and traumatic brain injury, the result of being in the presence of these IEDs and all of the explosions that men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan experienced. We are also dealing in this rough economy, this struggling economy, this high unemployment economy, with many young veterans coming home unable to find jobs. Some who left in National Guard, decent jobs, came home and found that those jobs are not there. We are dealing with a fact that I think virtually every member in the Senate understands, that at a time when the VA went from paper to digital, made the transformation necessary to deal with the claims process, that claims process today remains too long. The backlog is too great. We have got to deal with that issue. We are dealing with a situation, Mr. President, where people were wounded in war, men and women were wounded in war, young men and women who had hopes and dreams of starting their own families, but as a result of injuries sustained in those wars, for whatever reason, lost their reproductive capabilities, and they still want to have families. We are dealing with issues of sexual assault, a scandal, an outrage that I know every member of the Senate feels strongly about. Women and men sexually assaulted, coming home in need of treatment, unable to get that treatment. We are dealing with a situation today above and beyond the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where today there are people, often women, wives, sisters, who are taking care under great stress of disabled veterans who have no arms and no legs. They've devoted their lives to those people, and they are hurting as well. Mr. President, as chairman of the Veterans Committee, what I have done is listened as carefully as I could to what the veterans community, representing millions and millions of veterans, some 22 million veterans, had to say about the problems that veterans are facing. And I and my very fine staff and my Republican colleagues and their very fine staffs, we worked together. And we said, all right, these are the problems facing our veterans. And we all know that on Veterans Day and on Memorial Day, every member of the Senate goes out and they give great speeches about how much they love and respect veterans and how much they appreciate the sacrifices made by veterans. Well, now is the time to stand up and go beyond words and rhetoric. Now is the time to, in fact, address the real problems, the serious problems facing those men and women whose families experienced the ultimate sacrifice, and those men and women who came home wounded in body and in spirit. We cannot solve all of the problems facing veterans. We cannot bring back loved ones lost in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and the other wars. We can't bring them back to their wives, to their mothers and their dads, to their kids. We can't do that. And we cannot magically replace the arms and the legs lost in war or the eyesight lost in war. But we do have the moral obligation to do everything humanly possible to protect and defend those men and women who protected and defended us. That we can do and that we must do. Mr. President, I am very proud that this legislation that will soon be on the floor has the strong support of virtually every veterans and military organization in this country, and that includes all of the major organizations representing millions and millions of veterans. And I want to thank the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the VFW, the Disabled American Veterans, the DAV, the Vietnam Veterans of America, the Military Officers Association of America, the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, the Gold Star Wives, and dozens of other veterans and military organizations who are supporting this legislation. The Senate Veterans Affairs Committee has received letters of support from virtually all of these organizations, and if members want to check out why these organizations representing millions of veterans are supporting this bill, they will find those letters on our website. But let me just say this, that a quote from one of the letters, and that was from the Disabled American Veterans. And this is what they write, and I just quote one segment of it. This bill, unprecedented in our modern experience, this is from the DAV, would create, expand, advance, and extend a number of VA benefits, services, and programs that are important to DAV and to our members, end of quote. They see it, as do many of the other veterans organizations, as one of the most comprehensive pieces of veterans legislation brought forth in the modern history of Congress. And I'm proud of that. And I want to thank the veterans organizations not just for their support of this legislation, but for the help that they gave us in drafting this legislation. This legislation did not come from Bernie Sanders. It didn't come from anybody else on the committee. It came from the veterans community itself. It came from representatives of veterans organizations who came before us in hearings, who came before us in private meetings and said, Senator, here are the problems facing our veterans. And if you are serious about going beyond rhetoric and speeches and you really want to help veterans and their families, this is what needs to be done. And we listened. We listened. Couldn't do everything. But we did put in this bill many of the major concerns facing the veterans community. I want to thank the veterans organizations for being our partner in drafting this legislation. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those people who have currently co-sponsored that legislation, and that includes Senator Landrieu, Senator Begich, Senator Schatz, the presiding officer, thank you, Senator, Senator Brown, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Hirono, Senator Boxer, Senator Casey, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Heinrich, Senator Heitkamp, Senator Merkley, Senator Murray, Senator Reid, Senator Shaheen, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Rockefeller, Senator Tester, and Senator Cantwell. I thank all of them for their strong support. Mr. President, let me take a few minutes to just touch on some of the areas that this bill, this comprehensive bill, covers. And as I return to the floor in the coming days, I will go into greater length about each of these provisions, because each of these provisions unto themselves is enormously important in terms of the needs of our veterans. As I mentioned earlier, and consistent with what's on the floor right now, the prior bill, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2000, the bill that our comprehensive veterans bill will restore the cuts made in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013 to military retirees. So in our bill, we address that issue. This comprehensive veterans legislation deals with another issue, not necessarily a sexy issue, but one that in fact impacts a large number of veterans in communities all over America, and that is that it will allow VA to enter into 27 major medical facility leases in 18 states and Puerto Rico. And what that means is that for a variety of reasons too complicated to get into right now, we have CBOCs, community-based outreach clinics, and other veterans facilities that are ready to go, that are needed, that are on the drawing board, that are beyond being on the drawing board, but we haven't been able to pull the plug on it. It is very important to veterans all over this country. It is important to Republicans. It is important to Democrats. It is time to get this done. And by the way, this has been passed in the House of Representatives. We need to do it here, and that is part of this legislation. Mr. President, this legislation includes groundbreaking provisions that would expand access to VA health care. In my view, and in the view of veterans all over this country, the VA provides high-quality, cost-effective care to millions and millions of our veterans. Something like 6.2 million veterans are accessing VA health care today. About 8 million are in the program, signed up for VA care. What this legislation does is expand access to VA health care, allows more veterans to come in, ends a very complicated Priority 8 eligibility, a situation where we have hundreds and hundreds of different eligibility levels all over the country, making it very confusing for Priority 8 veterans to determine whether or not they are eligible. We end that, we simplify it. The result is that more veterans will be able to access VA health care. What we also do is expand complementary and alternative medicine within the VA. The truth is the VA is now doing a good job in providing complementary and alternative medicine. That means meditation, acupuncture, yoga, and other treatments to veterans who are concerned about not being dependent on medication. One of the great problems we have nationally and in the VA is over-medication of people who have problems associated with pain and other ailments. VA has done a good job. We are going to expand that opportunity. My experience, having gone around the country, is that both within the Department of Defense hospitals and the VA, more and more veterans are looking at these alternative-type treatments and want to break their dependence on over-medication. What we also do in this legislation is something terribly important. It is my strong belief that dental care must be considered a part of health care. And the fact is that in this country, we have millions of people above and beyond the veterans community who cannot find affordable dental care. Right now, within the VA, dental care, with the exception of service-connected problems, homeless veterans, is not open to veterans, and we begin the process through a significant pilot program to bring dental care into the VA. And that, to me, is extremely important, and I think for the veterans community is important. Mr. President, I think all of us remember, not so many months ago, the government of the United States was shut down, caused all kinds of problems for all kinds of people. What is not widely known is that veterans, disabled veterans, veterans who are receiving their pensions, were 7 to 10 days away from not getting their checks. So you got disabled veterans all over this country who live month to month through those checks were 7 to 10 days a week, 10 days away from not getting those checks. This legislation provides for advanced appropriations for mandatory VA benefits. And by passing that provision, we will never again put disabled vets or veterans who are dependent on their pensions in the position, if there is ever a shutdown, of not getting their checks when they need it. Mr. President, one of the issues that has been discussed a great deal is the issue of benefits backlog. There is no disagreement in this Senate, whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, that it is not acceptable for veterans who apply for benefits to have to wait years to get those benefits. In my view, what the VA is now doing is undergoing a massive transformation of their benefit system, going from paper, incomprehensible to me that in 2008 their system was paper, going from paper to digital. They are making progress, but I want to see them make more progress. This legislation includes some important provisions to make sure that we end this unacceptable backlog for VA benefits. One of the issues that has also received some attention is the issue of in-state tuition assistance for post-9/11 veterans. And what that has to do with is the fact that a number of years ago we passed very significant legislation which enables some 900,000 veterans today, post-9/11 veterans, to get education throughout this country, higher education, and family members as well. This legislation would give our transitioning service members a fair shot at attaining their educational goals without incurring an additional financial burden, and we deal with the issue of somebody from out of state moving into another state and making sure that that veteran is paying no more than what the in-state tuition is for that state. And this is a very important provision, and by the way, a provision that was passed in the House of Representatives. We have pretty much the same language here in this bill. Mr. President, what we did is promise veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan that they would have 5 years of free VA health care when they came home. We think it is important now, for a variety of reasons. People have not taken advantage of that. We think it's important to extend from 5 to 10 years unfettered access to VA health care for recently separated veterans, and that's what this legislation does. Mr. President, I don't have to mention to anybody that our economy, while slowly improving, still has many, many challenges. Unemployment much, much too high. What this legislation would do is reauthorize provisions from the Vow to Hire Heroes Act of 2011, including a 2-year extension for the Veterans Retraining Assistance Program, the VRAP program. In other words, what we are saying to our veterans is when you come home, we want a job to be there for you. We want you to get integrated back into civilian life. So we have some very important provisions in here for employment opportunities for our veterans. As I mentioned earlier, sexual assault is a scandal. The numbers are appallingly high. And what this legislation does is enable those women and men who were sexually assaulted to come into the VA to get the quality of care that their situations require and deserve. And this provision was inspired by Ruth Moore, who struggled for 23 years to receive VA disability compensation. So we have language in there making sure that those who suffered sexual assault will get the care within the VA that they absolutely are entitled to. I mentioned earlier also, Mr. President, that several thousand men and women who served in Iraq and Afghanistan were wounded in ways that make it impossible for them to have babies. And these are people who really want families. And some of them are now spending a very significant amount of money in the private sector through a number of approaches in order to be able to have babies, and we have language provision in this bill which would help female and male veterans who have suffered significant spinal cord, reproductive, and urinary tract injuries to start a family. I think that that is an absolutely right thing to do. Mr. President, several years ago, this Congress did the right thing by establishing a Caregivers Act, which said to those people who are caring for disabled vets that we understand how difficult that work is, that you are taking care of people who need constant attention, loved ones who need constant attention, and we are going to help you doing what you have been doing. The good news is that we passed that legislation. The bad news is that it only applied to post-9/11 veterans. And I think there was a general understanding and assumption that we were going to expand that program to all veterans, Vietnam, World War II, Korea, so that those people, mostly women who are staying home taking care of veterans, get the support that they need. So the extension of the Caregivers Act is also included in this legislation. Those are some of the provisions. This is a 400-page bill, and I just touched on some of them. But let me end in the way that I began. There is no way that we can ever fully repay the debt we owe to the men and women who put their lives on the line defending this country. That's just the simple nature of things. We're not going to bring back the husbands who were lost in war, the wives who came back without any legs. We're not going to bring fathers back to children who lost their dad or their mom. We're not going to restore eyesight to people who are blind. We can't do that. But if this country means anything, it means that we have got to keep the promises that we made to veterans and to their families. That while we can't do everything, we have got to do as much as we can to make the lives of our veterans and their families, their loved ones, as happy and productive as we possibly can. So this legislation is legislation that listened to our veterans, heard their concerns, worked with them, and developed this comprehensive bill. And let me conclude once again by thanking all of the veterans organizations. And we have virtually every veterans organization in America, not all, but almost all, supporting this legislation. We thank them for the work that they do every day on behalf of our veterans, and I thank them very much for all of the help they have provided me and the committee in writing this legislation. Mr. President, speeches on Veterans Day and Memorial Day are great. That's good. It's an important thing that we all do. But now is the time to go beyond speeches. Now is the time to address the problems facing the veterans community. This legislation does this in a very comprehensive way, and I ask for the support of all my colleagues in the Senate. Thank you. I yield the floor.